Hi, and welcome to a quick video on quantitative research philosophies. So hopefully you remember from 5010 or 5011 or the other video I posted that there are different worldviews. Here I've put them on a spectrum, which I find helpful in terms of thinking about them. From the more transformative constructivist perspective, which is almost exclusively qualitative, to the positive post-positivist angle, which is almost exclusively quantitative, and then pragmatists who are sort of in the middle and can use both or either. Now, of course, I say that, but in theory, qualitative and quantitative research can be used by almost anyone along the spectrum. I'm focusing over here on positivists and post-positivists because they're the engine that drives a lot of how we do quantitative research. They're sort of the foundation of how we do it. Their philosophies are what create the methods that we're going to use, or what underlie the methods that we're going to use, and that underlies the interpretations that we're going to offer and how we understand research. So that doesn't mean they're the only ones doing quantitative research, of course. It's just that that's the philosophy we're going to focus most on because it's the engine that sort of makes it go. So if you're unfamiliar with or interested in differences between all these elements of the spectrum, you should go watch the other video or take 5010 or 5011 because they'll talk a lot more about these sort of differences. And of course, if you're more interested in the qualitative side, specifically transformative constructivist sort of area, then that suggests you should probably take qualitative research. So here what we're really going to focus on is the distinction between positivist and post-positivist. So a quick little caveat here that a lot of researchers use post-positivist to mean everything that comes after positivism. So that would include things like constructivism and transformativism, and basically all of the more qualitative side of things. But we're not using it that way. In this case, we're using post-positivist to refer to a shift in positivism that has sort of resulted in its own worldview. So positivism is one of the earliest formal ways of doing research. Informally, of course, people have been doing research for millennia. But when we started to codify Western thought into a type of philosophy, positivism was basically the foundation of the scientific method. You'll recall in the Willingham reading that we once thought of science as like a secret decoder ring for God's plan. And that's really what the positive perspective is in action. In positivism, science is all about uncovering this like capital T truth. The scientific method is a way of uncovering the truth of the world and the truth of reality. Now, as we've evolved, we've come to understand that that doesn't really work. As you see in the Willingham reading, that's not really how most scientists think anymore. Rather, science has really evolved, and scientists with them, to have a better sense of our own limitations. So what that means in terms of philosophy is that post-positivists have taken a lot of the philosophical assumptions of positivism and softened them. They've been specifically softened around epistemology, which you guys will remember is how we know things. What is the nature of knowledge? So the big shift in post-positivism from positivism is in this second row. Where the positivists thought that the scientific method could measure one true reality, post-positivists now say that we as flawed humans can never truly measure reality. We can only ever have a probabilistic understanding. That means that we can take a relatively good guess, but we can never really confirm anything. Climate change is actually a really good example of this. When we say things like near scientific consensus, that's sort of a post-positivist way of phrasing it. People who say, no, it's a fact, those are coming from a more positivist perspective. Near scientific consensus is a good way of thinking about post-positivism. We're basically sure it's true, but we have to couch it in terms of a consensus because we can't ever say for sure. Now, that big shift has infected a lot of these other philosophical questions, though, because these ideas overlap and the boundaries are porous. So where positivism says that there's a single objective reality, post-positivism has to say, we think after, because they can't really say it's for sure because of that issue with epistemology. So if you consider that you can't ever truly know everything, then that's going to impact whether you can ever know that there's a single reality. Similarly, down here in axiology, there's another shift where positivists attempt neutrality and say that they are sort of unbiased. The science or researcher is an objective, unbiased observer of reality. For post-positivists, because as humans we can only sort of understand things, we can only probabilistically understand things, that means that we can't ever truly achieve neutrality. So we strive to be objective and unbiased, but we have to acknowledge that we can't fully achieve that. The only sort of philosophical underpinnings that aren't really affected are logic and methods. So post-positivism really takes basically whole cloth from positivism, the idea of a deductive, rational, formal logic, and the use of experiments, quasi-experiments, surveys, tests, etc. So essentially, when you break it down, research from positivists and post-positivists looks exactly the same. These are all the things that are the outcomes of the research, and those are exactly the same. It's on the interpretation level where there's any difference. So how we interpret the results of those studies are going to change. So to think about it another way, the philosophy of positivism is the basis for quantitative research methods, which is the basis for a certain interpretation of events or educational theories and practices. But over time, this was revealed to be a bit shaky. We weren't doing as good a job as we thought we were of interpreting things or applying knowledge in a way that was meaningful for people. So post-positivists came in and built off the general principles of positivism. They didn't touch the actual methods, but they offered a new way to support the interpretation and application of findings. And this, fundamentally, is the difference between post-positivists and those who take a more constructive or transformative view, your traditional qualitative research. When the flaws of positivism became apparent, post-positivists worked on buttressing the problem. They did that by addressing the gap between interpretation and the method. So they offered softer interpretations to account for the fact that the philosophies of positivism may not hold up. Qualitative researchers, on the other hand, sort of thought the problem was down here, and they focused on quantitative, the methods not really reflecting meaningful philosophy. So they sort of took issue with the more fundamental point of positivism, and that's when they switched away from doing quantitative methods and towards doing more qualitative methods. Now, you guys can come to whatever conclusion you choose. Personally, I sort of like post-positivism even with all its flaws. I find it helpful. That's also the way pragmatists typically take quantitative methods. If it works, if it's helpful, then great, and maybe we don't need to worry so much about the philosophy. Others have a really big issue with the philosophy and really can't move past that fundamental problem. And in that way, they can't ever really appreciate the methods. And in fairness, those weaknesses are bigger in education than they would be in other disciplines, so it's understandable when people are like, I just can't deal with quantitative methods in education. That's also fine. It's important to understand where different people are coming from and where the different ends of the spectrum are working, but it's okay to disagree with them. Life's a rich tapestry and education is complicated, and we're going to need lots of different kinds of research to do the best we can for students.